So, I mean, my book is partly trying to understand and explain the shift in politics from, essentially, up until 10, 15 years ago, we still thought of politics as essentially socioeconomic, about the basic unit was still social class, however fuzzy class was becoming. It was about arguments about market v state, size of the public sector, and so on. And that kind of politics is obviously, that left-right politics is obviously still here, but it has been kind of overlooked. It's been partly eclipsed, you might say, by socio-cultural politics. The security and identity issues have emerged very strongly to challenge the old socio-economic politics in some ways. And this hasn't just come out of the blue. It hasn't come, it's not because of the charismatic, the power of Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen or whoever the modern version of Jörg Haider is. It's because of people's, rational, if you like, reactions to big changes in our society, big openings in our society. And the reaction has also been partly to do with the emergence of a great sort of value schism in our society that I describe in using these labels: the people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere. Just to unpack those categories a little bit more, I mean, when I talk about the people from anywhere, I don't mean the elite. The elite are a subset of the anywheres. It's the only argument I had with Axel's interview with me the other day is he kept talking about the eliten. The anywheres are people who are highly educated, by which I mean basically graduates or more. They are, particularly in Britain, less so in continental Europe and America, but particularly in Britain, going to university means leaving home. It means changing your network of connections in life, which partly explains the anywhere worldview, I think. So the combination of being well educated, being mobile, and the combination of those two things tends to make people, not in every individual case, but as a rule, makes people more open. They place great stress on openness, autonomy. They're generally happy with social change. They like novelty. They're generally confident about the world, partly because the world is designed by and for people like them. So they can take social change confidently in their stride. And like I say, this is. I mean, there are subsets. I mean, the anywhere is a big baggy category, but there are certainly people who would count as the elite. There's a small subset I call the global villagers, about 3-5% of the population. Against the anywheres, you have the people who see the world from somewhere, who are a kind of mirror image in some ways, although they're a much larger proportion of the population, about 50%, and they tend to not be so well educated and to be much more rooted, to value security and familiarity perhaps more than the anywheres, to be more wary of social change, to be small c conservative. Now, not everybody, not every individual conforms again to this combination of views and attitudes, but as a general rule, that is the case. So the two big differences between anywheres and somewheres, I would say, are in attitudes to social change and in attitudes to group attachment. Anywheres, by dint of their biographies, often have quite weak group attachments. They no longer are attached to the place that they come from and the kinds of people that they grew up with. And somewheres are still attached to places and people like themselves, and that means they tend to be much more comfortable with, indeed, it forms a much more important part of the backdrop to their lives, group attachments, both big, abstract, kind of national attachments, but also kind of local attachment. A lot of people say, oh, but this is so binary, you know, anywheres and somewheres, life's much more complicated than that. Well, of course, life is much more complicated than that. And actually, as writers tiresomely say, if you buy my book and read it, you will see that there is actually, I mean, I do talk about the distinctions within these two large blocks, and there's also a big a group of people I call the in-betweeners. I don't particularly talk very much about them, it's true, but there's a group, about 25% of the population, who have an almost equally divided worldview, both anywhere and somewhere. So let me just quickly move on to the issue of kind of why this has emerged so much more now. I mean, I touched on that earlier. It's, I think, partly in response to you know, the Brexit Trump populism is partly a somewhere response to feeling excluded from the political process. The feeling that anywhere domination has been so total in our societies, just in the last 20 years or so, that a large proportion of somewheres, at least in Britain, stopped voting. I don't know what the position is here, but I think about 3 million people who voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit referendum had not voted in the preceding 5 or 6 general elections because they thought, and with some reason, there's no point voting because I will end up with a government of anywheres. They wouldn't have used that phrase, because they agree on the broad sort of, you know, liberal worldview. They want an open economy. They're comfortable with immigration. They think the knowledge economy is a wonderful thing. Obviously, the knowledge economy that benefits highly educated people. They are part of. This is a theme that we could perhaps come back to. I think the whole domination in our society by cognitive elites, the way in which a certain, you might say, quite narrow form of human aptitude, cognitive ability, has come to be seen as the kind of gold standard of human esteem, and other virtues, character, virtue, you know, Christian virtue, emotional intelligence, often things that we associate with the private realm of, you know, traditional female values, even of kind of nurture and care and so on, have been somewhat diminished as cognitive ability has kind of swept all before it, and I think left a lot of people feeling diminished too. I think the other important thing is the way in which what one might call technocratic depoliticization has happened in all our societies. I think probably again maybe more acutely in the UK, by which I mean more and more things have been taken out of the everyday democratic contest. So you have WTO rules that take a whole lot of things outside, or things that used to be part of the kind of everyday democratic contest. They're removed. The European Union itself obviously takes a huge number of things out of the everyday democratic contest, you know, including immigration as a result of free movement. And that had a particular impact. Obviously, one of the main reasons, if not the main reason why we voted for Brexit, was because of free movement. And just in brackets here, I mean, I would say it's not because British people are more xenophobic than people in other countries. Obviously, free movement has been happening in other big economies too. The reason why it is so important in Britain is essentially because of the Margaret Thatcher reforms to our labour market. We have a very flexible labour market. So people, indeed our whole growth model, you might say, in the last 30 years has essentially been flexible labour market plus very, very high levels of labour market participation. I think it's now up to sort of 78% or something, topped up by very high immigration. That is our growth model. So free movement has impacted people in Britain much more than, you know, in France, Germany. You know, Germany has, you know, similar numbers, but because of different labour market regulations, it impacts the average worker much less, I would argue.
I would like to start with a personal question.
Yeah.
In your book, which I really enjoyed reading, You mentioned that writing an essay in 1997 was somehow a turning point in your thinking. You mentioned that you wrote an article where you dared to pose the question, are we too diverse? And obviously, after that, you witnessed some ancient form of a shitstorm. So I would like to know, because to me you seem like a prototype of an anywhere.
No, well, I am.
So what drove you away to a certain degree from your liberal tribe?
Prospect magazine, the magazine I set up and used to edit. We used to have these round table debates, and people would come together and talk about. And David Goodhart came and spoke at one on welfare and welfare reform, and he talked about something which it never really occurred to me before, and I became very interested. He was basically talking about how there's a trade-off in welfare states between high levels of kind of cultural, I mean, not necessarily ethnic, but often it will be ethnic, cultural homogeneity, a kind of recognition of shared fate, shared history, and so on. People are more likely to be ready to share with each other, to share with people in that society, and so it's no coincidence that the high welfare state spending societies tend to have been relatively homogeneous ones. The Scandinavians are often cited, and in more diverse societies. And in fact, Willits made the contrast between Sweden become a lot less homogeneous since he spoke, actually, and America. You can either have Sweden, where you have high homogeneity and high welfare sharing, or you can have America, where you have much greater diversity and much lower propensity to share. And it seemed to me a kind of it's one of those statements of the obvious that I'd never really thought of before, but seemed to be a really interesting subject. So I spent a year or so sort of thinking about it and reading things, and then I wrote this essay, which was essentially about that, exploring that theme, as you say, called Too Diverse. And it was the fact that it was reprinted in the Guardian newspaper, the main liberal newspaper in Britain, and that did cause...
What was the reaction like?
I was called a racist, a nice powerlite, in reference to Enoch Powell, various other things, and I did feel persecuted.
You felt that it was not allowed to criticize these developments or analyze it, or
yes, but just because at that moment the society was starting to get anxious about the subject again. So we had that first wave of post-colonial immigration. The numbers then came down because Parliament could respond to people's anxieties, and did respond. So there was a kind of trade-off. We will have decent equality laws, race discrimination laws that will clamp down on racism, but we will keep an eye on. We'll make sure the numbers don't get too high, and that is what happened. But then '97 comes, and you have the new Labour government, and the doors are opened again. You get a really dramatic increase, and then 2004 we have the opening to Eastern Europe. So I wrote this piece into an atmosphere that was getting quite tense on the subject. So a lot of people were kind of ready to abuse me because I was just raising questions, and I was fingering something that was particularly sensitive on the left. I mean, I was essentially saying to the left, to the centre left, that the two principles that you hold most dear, diversity and solidarity, are actually in conflict, or at least you have to worry about the tension between the two of them. And if you don't, there's going to be trouble.
If you may allow one more question, because I really found it interesting. You said that part of the problem is so-called depoliticization of the debates or of the politics. I found that interesting in a way because and immediately Angela Merkel popped up in my head because in many incidents she talked of political decisions being without any alternative.
Right,
so
yeah,
she called it alternative laws.
Yeah.
And even before that, starting in the 90s, there were many arguments like this, that something is without any alternative, that the political room for maneuvering is shrinking and shrinking. In German it was called Sachzwang, Logik. And what I want to ask you is, do you think that somehow the anywheres, the liberals, whatever you may call them, stopped explaining what they are doing, stopped asking questions, became maybe a little bit too dogmatic?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I, in a sense, I was a kind of victim of that dogma at the time. And that made me, in fact, that's perhaps why I've come to write this book. I mean, having that experience made me very aware of the fact that, my liberal tribe, as it were not expressing some kind of neutral, eternal values. They were just as partisan and prejudiced as the people they thought of as the conservatives or the nativists or whatever. And I think that's exactly right. And that, in a sense, is still what I'm trying to argue. And what I argue in The Road to Somewhere is that when you take anywheres regard their own political priorities as fact, as neutral, so there is no alternative. We Tina, as we call it in our politics. What people mean by that is, there is no alternative to the anywhere worldview, and you can bet your bottom dollar. I mean, when these different aspects of economics or politics are taken out of the democratic sphere and are decided by committees of experts in one place or another, you can bet your bottom dollar that they will be decided according to the priorities of anywheres. I think the somewheres are, on the whole, I invent this phrase, decent populists. And what I mean by decent populist is that they they don't like a lot of the changes that have happened in our societies over the last 20-25 years, but they have, on the whole, gone along with the great liberalisation. They have gone along with the great and it's there in the attitudes data on race, on gender, on sexuality. They have accepted it. It's not perhaps it's not, these things are not the equalities and the struggle to become a more culturally equal society in those areas are not necessarily somewhere priorities, but they have accepted, and often they live equality, often certainly in terms of race equality, much more than many anywheres who tend to live in areas of quite low minority population. I think a very annoying illusion that people that anywheres people writing about populism often talk about how such and such a populist party, or indeed an individual, are hostile to immigrants. I think that is very rarely the case. People are hostile to mass immigration and the effects that it has on them economically, culturally perhaps, in the sense of their neighbourhood changing too fast. But they will very rarely be hostile to individual immigrants. Indeed, will often have immigrants or people from minority backgrounds as friends.
To what extent this is a symmetrical or asymmetrical situation? To what extent on the conservative side you're going to see somebody like you, which is part of the tribe, who is saying, listen, we were right to believe that anywheres cannot simply ignore the politics of the normal people, and when you talk about the primacy of the politics, This is one of the famous titles of a book about the emergence of social democracy in the 20th century. It was about the primacy of the politics. The state can control the market. The vote should matter. But if you have a kind of a less intellectual community, how this should operate? How you're going to have to this bridging, where in a certain way rethinking should take part on both sides? Because you're not going to go back to 1970s. You never can go back anywhere, for good or bad.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but this is, I mean, you know, and yeah, and of course, this is, you know, people, you know, liberals, you know, worry about the return of the 1930s, and that is often the reason given for kind of, you know, we must not give the, you know, this kind of return of somewhere power must be crushed. You know, the Anthony Graylings. Well, if you know the British debate, you know, we must not give an inch. You know, we must. Brexit is a disaster. You know, we must kind of reinstitute untrammeled anywhere power, and a lot of it is, I think, premised on an assumption that we can slip back to the 1930s. I think for all sorts of reasons that is. I mean, you can never say never, but I think it is so improbable. I mean, for various reasons. I mean, we are much older societies. You know, the European societies that produced the disasters of the 1930s were very young societies. They had lots of young men roaming the streets, many of them traumatized from their experiences in the First World War. We have a few people traumatized from their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I mean, we're talking about a tiny, tiny number. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, you know, walking these streets. We are much richer than we were in the 1930s. And I think, you know, notwithstanding people's sort of gut connections that still exist and that they value, we're also, that sits alongside kind of a sense of embedded rights that everybody has. And, you know, including minority rights of various kinds. I mean, I have this argument, you know, your triangulation about liberal and democracy, the two parts of the term coming apart. I think there's much more evidence in my technocratic depoliticization, much more evidence for undemocratic liberals than there is for illiberal Democrats. I mean, you know, the burkini ban, you know, collapsed in giggles. You know, okay, the Swiss have banned the building of new minarets, which is inconvenient for Swiss Muslims. But I mean, there is no, you know, the open society is not under threat. I think the triangulation doesn't work. I mean, because it's only on, or almost entirely on one side. And the only argument for, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about illiberal Democrats, but there isn't very much evidence for it. And I think, you know, and that is where I think the 1930s example is, you know, is wrong, really.
On one thing I agree very much, and the major difference is that we do not have political powers that believe in the transformative power of violence, which was very typical both for the... On the other side, it's nationally specific. When you're saying basically that you don't feel this, probably in Britain. Talk to some Poles or Hungarians, they're going to tell you different stories.
Thank you. My question would be, you mentioned in the beginning that you think this populist wave is sort of a rational reaction to certain developments. And I wondered, and you also said your argument wasn't dichotomous, but to me it sort of seemed, because I wondered, can you not be in favor of diversity and have a socio-culturally liberal attitude, but still be very much in favor of regulating the economy? I mean, the leftist position, quite simply put. And so if a rational reaction would perhaps have been voting for someone like Bernie Sanders, but not for someone like Donald Trump. And I think if we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, are these people worried about the undemocratic structure of the economy, or are they more worried about issues like people with different skin colors and different sexual orientations? And I think there has to be this sort of third possible position at least taken into account?
Yeah, I mean, I think this. Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it goes to the heart of the way in which sort of left-right politics have got out of sync with and don't really work in an age of socio-cultural politics, because the left wants to control the economy and it wants the society and the culture to be as open as possible, and I suppose you might say the right wants the other way round. That they believe still more in controlling immigration and national social contracts, but they want a much more open economy. And I think it is, who was it? Daniel Bell, the famous American political scientist, who said, his political credo was, I think he actually said, I'm a social democrat. Yeah, well,
liberal in politics and conservative in culture.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I would slightly rephrase it and say, he's a kind of market-friendly social democrat in economics. After all, he was an American, and a liberal in politics, and somewhat conservative on cultural and social matters. And I would say that is where the majority of people in most of our societies are. But for all sorts of historical and contingent reasons, no political party has ever emerged to capture that combination.
Well, I like the last chapter of your book. I don't think it's the weakest one. I understood it as a kind of, let's say, an introduction for the next book to come, no? Where you could elaborate the political propositions. In the center of your propositions, if I understood it well, is that there is no other way than to integrate the legitimate populism in the political game. Now, okay, if we look at that and if we see how the parties behave, particularly the leftist parties, wherever in the United States as well as in continental Europe and in the UK, if it is Corbyn, if it is Renzi, if it is Kern, if it is Nales, whatever, it seems that they don't understand the reaction of the electorate. So you would expect them to move in a direction to accept this kind of legitimate populism, but no, they are concentrating on marginalized groups, on diversity, and so on. No? Yeah. Now, what is it? What is the reason for that? Is it that let's say that they are so shaped in their anywhere cultural model, no, that they don't even understand what's going on? Or is it, and I think that could be also the problem, that the whole political class, in the sense of Pareto and Mosca, is leaving the democratic contest. So they say, whatever the people vote, we don't care because we want to continue this kind of policy we have been following before.
To your point, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this kind of slightly bizarre politics, you might say, of the modern left is sort of sociologically obvious. The modern left, I mean, probably here too, but completely in Britain, has been taken over by liberal graduates. Centre-left parties are liberal graduate parties. That's what they are. I mean, and most of the working class doesn't even vote for them, let alone join them, become party members. I mean, there are a few, obviously, who both vote for them and maybe members in some of the old sort of industrial heartland areas. And I think it is much harder for highly ideological, highly educated, liberal graduate cadres of these parties to shift to the right on cultural issues. They would rather die than accept a more natalist family policy or really tight restrictions on immigration. And actually, this is why we are going to be ruled by the centre-right forever, because it's much easier, and indeed we saw this at the last election in the UK, it's much easier for the right to move left on economics than it is for the left to move right on culture. That is why Jeremy Corbyn will never be in number 10 Downing Street, or it is one of the reasons why he will never be in number 10 Downing Street. I think there are possible settlements, and I think Brexit is the beginning of a settlement. And perhaps I was too unkind to my final chapter. I mean, there are lots of things that we can do, and actually, unless we give away all the freedoms, which I fear we may do before we leave the European Union, there are lots of things that are easier now to do than they would have been when we were still in the European Union. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes of Brexit. For me, I mean, I would still regard myself as a social democrat. I mean, I kind of rather go along with the Daniel Bell combination, but I would certainly regard myself as a social democrat still. One of the paradoxes of Brexit is that it's an opportunity to break out of this UK growth model, which I described earlier, which is essentially, derived from the great. I mean, there's a lot to be said for flexible labour markets. Don't get me wrong, but they do tend to kind of bias your economy in a certain way, and that combination of, and we've been, we are a kind of low productivity, lowish wage economy because of the flexible labour market plus stuffing as many people into jobs as possible. We are an amazing machine for creating jobs. We have been employer of last resort for the whole of blinking Europe. To break out of that pattern, oddly enough, we have to leave in order to have a more European-style economy that actually invests more in people, we have to leave the European Union. So one might argue, anyway. And I think we can start doing that. And I'm a bit exasperated that so much of the discussion in Britain has been about, partly because anywheres obviously dominate the discussion, even post-Brexit. Brexit has been an enormous rebalancing of power between anywheres and somewheres, as you say, a hugely important rebalancing of power. But of course, the ball goes back into the anywhere court as soon as the somewheres have stuffed their ballots in the referendum box. And you see that the entire debate in Britain is dominated by economistic remainers. We're arguing about whether we're going to be £500 poorer in 7 years' time as a result of Brexit, or we're arguing constantly about trade arrangements, what kind of customs union we might have. And then actually what we should be talking about is the fact that we can actually have a proper regional and industrial policy now in Britain if we leave the European Union. There are some optimistic trends here too, I think. That there are the sort of trends that in a way work in favour of more somewhere intuitions than anywhere intuitions, you might say. I think the next round of, somewheres have already, working class somewheres have already taken the big hit on mechanisation and automation. The next big hit from AI is going to come to the sort of slightly lower level anywhere professional jobs, isn't it? It's going to automate, accountancy and law and some aspects of medicine. So that in itself might make anywheres a little bit more sensitive to economic shocks and rapid social change and how unpleasant it is. But also, I think as we get older as societies, there'll be much more stress on caring functions and emotional intelligence and things other than cognitive ability. We have become so, like I said, the idea of cognitive ability is the kind of gold standard of human esteem. I think it's been a very destructive aspect of development in recent decades. Actually, and someone wrote me a letter. Someone who'd read my book wrote me a letter, which I kind of want to make the subject of my next book, and said that a good society is one in which you have a kind of equal balance between the three H's. It sounds a bit naff, but actually I think it's sort of true, that the head, the hand, and the heart.
I do believe that we all get some sense of somewhere. Thank you very very much, and also I hope that we also contributed to the next book.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.